During World War II, the FBI intercepted a letter that should have been harmless. It talked about dolls, repairs, families. Nothing secret, nothing illegal, but something didn't sit right. When agents traced the sender, the woman said she never wrote it. Then another woman said the same thing, then another. Different cities, different names, same letters. Someone was stealing identities, copying handwriting, and mailing coded messages, not with numbers or symbols, but with ordinary words. Dolls meant warships. Repairs meant damage from Pearl Harbor, and the mail was telling the enemy which ships were coming back to fight. The spy wasn't hiding in an embassy. She wasn't foreign. She wasn't armed. She ran a luxury doll shop on Madison Avenue, and for years she proved the most dangerous intelligence leaks don't look dangerous at all. In the early months of 1942, when the United States had fully entered a global war, and the Atlantic and Pacific had become theaters of constant movement and threat, the federal machinery of surveillance settled into a relentless rhythm. Mail moved by the ton across cities and oceans, but it no longer traveled unseen. Censorship offices operated day and night, staffed by men and women trained to detect the slightest irregularity in tone, phrasing, destination, or pattern. The work was repetitive, methodical, and exhausting. Yet it was guided by a single principle. Ordinary correspondence could no longer be assumed harmless. Every envelope carried the potential to inform an enemy. One such envelope arrived among thousands routed through wartime inspection. It bore nothing remarkable at first glance. The paper was clean, the handwriting neat, the postage correct. Its destination was South America, addressed to a location in Buenos Aires. The content inside appeared domestic and specialized, the kind of niche communication that rarely attracted interest. The letter discussed dolls. It referenced antique figures, materials, national styles, and conditions of preservation. The language was specific, but not coded in any obvious way. To a casual reader, it would have passed as a collector's exchange, a routine message between enthusiasts separated by geography, but united by a shared interest. The letter did not trigger alarms because of its subject. It did so because of its timing and destination. In early 1942, Buenos Aires had become a focal point for Allied intelligence services. Argentina remained officially neutral, yet it was widely known to host active Axis intelligence networks, including German and Japanese operatives operating under diplomatic, commercial, and cultural cover. Correspondence, routed there, was subjected to additional scrutiny, not because it was necessarily hostile, but because it had the potential to be exploited. The censor handling the letter did not initially interpret its contents as subversive. However, training emphasized that intelligence transmission did not always rely on obvious encryption. Entire words, phrases, or subjects could serve as substitutes for classified information if sender and recipient shared prior understanding. The letter was set aside for secondary review, not flagged as dangerous, but marked as unusual enough to warrant a closer look. As the weeks passed, additional letters of similar nature appeared. They were not identical, but they shared characteristics. Each discussed dolls in meticulous detail. Each referenced quantities, conditions, locations, and movement. Each was addressed to South American destinations, associated with known intelligence interest. None of the letters contained overt political references, military terminology, or strategic language. Their harmlessness was, paradoxically, what made them suspicious. The United States Navy, at the same time, was engaged in constant logistical movement. Shipyards, along both coasts, worked without pause. Vessels damaged in early Pacific engagements were undergoing repair. Defensive measures were being installed at ports considered vulnerable to submarine attack. Information about which ships were under repair, which were docked, and which had returned to service was among the most tightly controlled categories of wartime intelligence. Any leak, however indirect, could alter enemy calculations. The letters were quietly forwarded to specialists trained to look beyond surface meaning. Linguistic analysts and cryptographers examined the structure of the language. They noted recurring patterns. Certain types of dolls were mentioned repeatedly. References to national origin appeared in contexts that suggested classification rather than decoration. Descriptions of condition and repair coincided too closely with known naval activity to be dismissed as coincidence. The analysts did not immediately identify a code, but they recognized what they were seeing: an open code, one that relied on shared terminology rather than mathematical substitution. This method was not new, but it was rarely effective without discipline. It depended on precision, consistency, and restraint. The sender had to maintain plausible deniability while conveying accurate information. Any deviation risked exposure. Whoever had written the letters understood this balance. Attention shifted from the letters themselves to their origin. The names signed at the bottom appeared to belong to private individuals, doll collectors scattered across the western United States. These were not known intelligence figures. They were civilians, most with no public record of foreign travel or political involvement. Yet the writing style across the letters was remarkably consistent. So was the formatting. More telling still was the typing. Wartime forensic techniques, though limited by modern standards, were capable of identifying unique mechanical signatures produced by typewriter keys and alignment. Investigators began assembling a quiet profile. The letters had been typed, not handwritten. Some had been mailed from different cities, yet their mechanical characteristics matched. This suggested either a single typewriter transported across locations, or access to multiple machines of identical make and wear. An unlikely coincidence. Hotel registries from the West Coast began to intersect with known travel patterns of a married couple, who had stayed in multiple locations during the relevant period. Each hotel possessed publicly accessible typewriters in business centers or writing rooms. The investigation remained discreet. Wartime authorities were cautious about overreaction. False accusations carried consequences, and intelligence resources were stretched thin. Yet as evidence accumulated, the possibility of an active domestic espionage operation became impossible to ignore. The letters were not numerous, but their content suggested quality over quantity. Even limited insight into naval repair schedules and defensive readiness could provide strategic advantage. Behind the paper trail stood a figure who did not match the prevailing image of a spy. There were no clandestine meetings observed, no intercepted radio transmissions, no visible exchanges of documents. In shadowed corridors, the suspected sender operated openly, conducted legitimate business, and moved comfortably within respectable society. The outward normalcy was complete. The focus of the inquiry narrowed to a woman operating a specialized retail business in New York City. Her establishment catered to collectors of antique and foreign dolls, a clientele that included diplomats, travelers, and individuals with international connections. The shop was located in a prominent area, its displays curated with care, its reputation built on expertise and exclusivity. It was not a front in the conventional sense. It was a functioning business, profitable, and socially visible. The woman behind the shop, Velvalee Dickinson, had a background that on paper appeared unremarkable. Born in California, educated at a prestigious university, and previously employed in banking and brokerage work, she possessed organizational discipline and familiarity with documentation. Her marriage had introduced her to social circles where international exchange was routine, rather than exceptional. Before the war, such associations had drawn little attention. After Pearl Harbor, they took on new significance. Federal agents did not immediately confront her. Instead, they observed. Financial records were examined for inconsistencies. Travel histories were cross-referenced with letter mailing locations. Known associations were quietly cataloged. The investigation moved slowly, deliberately, constrained by legal requirements and the need to preserve secrecy. Any premature action could alert other intelligence operatives or compromise broader efforts. Meanwhile, the letters continued. Not all reached their destinations. Several were returned undelivered, marked with routine postal notices. These returns proved critical. One of the individuals whose name had been used as a sender recognized it as fraudulent and contacted authorities. That single action confirmed what investigators had suspected, but could not yet prove. The sender was operating under borrowed identities to distribute information while masking its origin. With confirmation came urgency. The scope of the operation was reassessed. Analysts reconstructed the information conveyed in the letters, mapping doll descriptions to known naval data. They identified references to specific shipyards, repair statuses, and defensive installations. The accuracy of the information suggested access to current intelligence, obtained not through direct espionage inside military facilities, but through observation, conversation, and inference. Ship movements were visible. Repairs took time. Defensive measures were discussed indirectly in civilian contexts. The sender had assembled fragments into a coherent picture and transmitted it abroad. The danger lay not only in what had already been sent, but in what could still be transmitted. Wartime intelligence work was as much about prevention as prosecution. Authorities faced a dilemma: arrest too early, and they might lose insight into a broader network. Wait too long, and additional sensitive information could reach enemy hands. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the operation had not been careless. There were no incriminating notes left behind, no obvious storage of classified documents. The cash transactions, though significant, were structured to appear legitimate. Yet patterns emerged. Deposits coincided with known diplomatic movements. Funds traced back indirectly to sources associated with foreign missions. The evidence was circumstantial, but increasingly persuasive. By late 1943, the balance shifted. The war had entered a new phase. Allied momentum in the Pacific increased the value of naval intelligence, even as it heightened counterintelligence vigilance. The risk of allowing the operation to continue outweighed the benefits of further observation. Authorization was granted to move forward. The arrest, when it came, would be unremarkable. In execution, there would be no dramatic pursuit, no public spectacle at the moment of detention. The objective was containment, not theater. Agents would wait for a moment that minimized disruption and maximized evidentiary access. That moment arrived in January 1944, when Dickinson visited a Manhattan bank to access her safe deposit box. Surveillance teams were already in position. The arrest would secure not only her person, but whatever financial instruments or documents she had chosen to store under institutional protection. When agents intervened, they did so calmly and efficiently. The cash recovered confirmed long-standing suspicions about foreign compensation. Public revelation followed later, framed by wartime censorship and prosecutorial strategy. Headlines focused on the novelty of the case, the contrast between dolls and destruction, domestic commerce and global conflict. Yet behind the narrative simplicity lay a sobering reality. The operation had succeeded for a time, because it exploited assumptions. It relied on the belief that danger announced itself loudly, that spies looked like enemies, and that innocence could be inferred from appearance and occupation. The case, defined by a single letter, and the discipline of those trained to question it, underscored a lesson intelligence agencies would carry forward long after the war ended. Espionage did not always arrive encrypted or disguised in overt secrecy. Sometimes it traveled in plain envelopes, written in careful language, discussing objects no one expected to matter. By the time the full scope of Dickinson's activities became known, the damage could not be precisely measured. Intelligence work rarely allowed for certainty in such assessments. What could be said with confidence was that the system had worked just in time. The letters had been noticed, the patterns had been traced, the assumption of harmlessness had been challenged. The war would continue for more than a year after her sentencing, shaped by battles far larger than any single intelligence case. Yet within the machinery of that global conflict, the story of the doll woman remained a reminder that vigilance depended not on spectacle, but on patience, skepticism, and the willingness to examine even the most ordinary details with disciplined attention. The story did not begin with betrayal. In a dramatic sense, it began with routine work, with people trained to read carefully, and with the understanding that in wartime, nothing could be assumed to be merely what it appeared to be. Velvalee Dickinson entered adulthood long before the world began sorting people into categories of ally and enemy. She was born in October 1893 in Sacramento, California, into a household shaped by stability, rather than hardship. Her parents were American-born, rooted in the routines of a society that valued order, respectability, and education. Nothing in her early environment suggested rebellion or extremity. Her upbringing reflected the expectations placed on middle-class women of her generation: discipline, social awareness, and the quiet cultivation of competence. Her academic path reinforced those traits. She attended Stanford University at a time when higher education for women was still selective and socially significant. University life placed her among peers who expected achievement and refinement. She completed her studies in 1918, though a dispute over library materials delayed the formal issuance of her degree until 1937. The delay did not appear to trouble her professional trajectory, but it demonstrated something subtle about her character. She did not abandon institutions when friction arose. She waited, persisted, and resolved matters through procedural means rather than confrontation. After Stanford, she entered the workforce during a period when women were increasingly visible in clerical and financial roles. Banking work demanded precision and confidentiality. Brokerage employment required discretion and comfort with financial instruments. These were not glamorous positions, but they were environments where accuracy mattered and mistakes carried consequences. They also introduced her to documentation, structured communication, and the importance of presenting reliability. She learned how systems function from the inside, how information flowed, and how records could be both revealing and concealing. Her marriage to Terry Dickinson further expanded her exposure to international circles. Dickinson was involved in brokerage and maintained business and social relationships that extended beyond American borders. Through him, Velvalee encountered individuals connected to foreign trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. In California, during the interwar years, Japanese-American social organizations and Japan-U.S. friendship societies operated openly, promoting cultural understanding and mutual respect. Participation in such groups carried no stigma. They were viewed as respectable, even enlightened. Velvalee moved comfortably within these environments. She was observant, rather than conspicuous, attentive rather than outspoken. Contemporary accounts described her as composed and deliberate. She did not cultivate notoriety. She cultivated credibility. These social settings offered exposure to international perspectives at a time when America still viewed global affairs as distant concerns. The Pacific Ocean felt wide, and war felt theoretical. The 1920s and early 1930s unfolded without incident. In her personal narrative, she worked, traveled, and socialized within accepted norms. Economic upheaval during the Great Depression affected many, but she did not publicly experience crisis. Her professional life remained intact. She adapted as circumstances required, shifting roles rather than resisting change. This adaptability would later prove significant. By the mid-1930s, Velvalee and her husband relocated east. New York City offered opportunity, anonymity, and scale. It was a place where specialization could thrive. where niche interests supported entire businesses. In 1937, she entered the doll trade not as a hobbyist, but as an entrepreneur. She began as a saleswoman, learning inventory, sourcing, and client preferences. Dolls, particularly antique and foreign varieties, occupied a curious space between art, history, and nostalgia. Collectors valued provenance, condition, and authenticity. Transactions involved research, correspondence, and trust. When she opened her own shop on Madison Avenue, it was not positioned as novelty retail. It was curated, deliberate, and restrained. The clientele reflected that positioning. Collectors with means, travelers with exposure to foreign markets, and diplomats seeking culturally significant objects all passed through its doors. The shop operated during standard business hours. It maintained records. It paid rent. Nothing about it suggested subterfuge. Yet the shop's nature offered advantages that would only later be understood. Its subject matter was inherently international. Discussions of origin, transport, restoration, and valuation were routine. Shipping inquiries crossed borders. Letters traveled abroad. The language of the trade required specificity, without sensationalism. It also demanded discretion. Collectors did not appreciate publicity. Diplomats did not advertise purchases. Privacy was expected. Velvalee thrived in this environment. She mastered terminology. She understood how to describe objects precisely while remaining accessible. She handled correspondence with care. Letters were typed cleanly, formatted consistently, and mailed punctually. Customers trusted her assessments. Suppliers relied on her follow-through. The shop became a legitimate hub of information exchange, entirely civilian in appearance. The late 1930s brought shifts that were perceptible, but not yet destabilizing. News from Europe grew darker. Asia simmered with conflict. Yet the United States remained officially distant. For many Americans, including those engaged in international commerce, the tension felt abstract. Business continued. Social functions persisted. The Dickinsons maintained relationships cultivated over years, not suddenly severed by geopolitical change. Velvalee's associations with Japanese individuals and institutions predated hostilities. They were not clandestine. They were documented, public, and culturally sanctioned. This context mattered. It meant that when war eventually arrived, these connections did not originate in opportunism. They already existed. The question that would later preoccupy investigators was not how such relationships began, but how they evolved once the global landscape transformed. Her temperament suited gradual transitions. She was not impulsive. She did not seek attention. Her professional success depended on patience, credibility, and long-term relationships. These qualities allowed her to navigate changing circumstances without drawing scrutiny. When the United States edged closer to conflict, she did not publicly alter her routines. There were no recorded speeches, pamphlets, or organizational leadership roles that suggested radicalization. Her life presented as orderly, conventional, and focused. This absence of visible extremism would later complicate the narrative constructed around her actions. It challenged assumptions about motive and intent. None of these attributes constituted wrongdoing. Taken together, they formed a profile that did not attract attention in peacetime. Yet history would reframe them under the pressure of war. Investigators would later reconstruct her pre-war life not to assign retroactive guilt, but to understand how an ordinary trajectory intersected with extraordinary circumstances. By the time Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Velvalee Dickinson was a middle-aged business owner with a stable reputation and established routines. The attack did not immediately transform her outward behavior. The shop did not close overnight. She did not flee. She did not retreat from public life. She continued operating within the same systems she had always known, even as those systems rapidly recalibrated around her. Her story was not about espionage. It was about preparation without intention, capability without declared purpose. It demonstrated how a life built on order, discretion, and specialization could later be reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion, once national survival became the overriding concern. The war would supply the catalyst. The choices that followed would redefine everything that came before. A decision is made, but with a condition. Velvalee Dickinson stood at the threshold of a world that no longer tolerated ambiguity. Her past had equipped her well for success in commerce and society. It would soon place her under scrutiny in a conflict where ordinary skills could become instruments of national consequence. The world Velvalee Dickinson inhabited before the war was structured around continuity, rather than rupture. International relationships existed within a framework that assumed stability, even as tensions quietly accumulated beneath the surface. In the decades between the First World War and the Second, American society, particularly in coastal cities, treated foreign engagement as a mark of sophistication, rather than risk. Cultural exchange, trade associations, and diplomatic social functions operated openly, and participation in them carried social value. Dickinson's life unfolded comfortably. Within this environment, Dickinson and her husband participated in this world without distinction. Their attendance at cultural events and social functions followed the conventions of the time. There was no indication that these interactions were concealed or coded. They occurred in well-lit rooms, documented by invitations and programs. Such participation did not attract the attention of authorities, because it was not considered unusual. Prior to the late 1930s, Japan was viewed as a rising power, but not yet as an inevitable adversary. Through these associations, Dickinson became familiar with Japanese customs, etiquette, and social hierarchies. She learned how representatives of another nation presented themselves abroad, how they cultivated relationships, and how they maintained communication across borders. This familiarity was not exceptional in international cities, but it required attentiveness. Dickinson was observant. She absorbed information without seeking to dominate conversations. She listened, remembered names, and understood the importance of continuity in relationships. When she later relocated to New York, those skills transferred seamlessly. New York was a city defined by foreign presence. Diplomatic missions, consulates, and trade offices operated openly. Cultural exchange was not peripheral, it was foundational. Businesses that dealt in imported goods naturally intersected with foreign nationals. Dickinson's doll shop, focused on antique and culturally significant pieces, existed at that intersection. The shop's subject matter demanded international awareness. Dolls were not generic commodities. They were artifacts shaped by national tradition, historical context, and craftsmanship. Japanese dolls in particular carried ceremonial significance. They were associated with seasonal festivals, rites of passage, and regional styles. Collectors expected sellers to understand these distinctions. Dickinson did. She learned to describe not only physical characteristics, but origin, purpose, and lineage. This expertise attracted a clientele that included individuals accustomed to international travel and cross-border correspondence. Diplomats, collectors, and intermediaries visited the shop, not because it was hidden, but because it was reputable. Transactions required trust. Provenance mattered. Documentation mattered. Letters were exchanged to confirm details, arrange shipments, and discuss valuation. Such correspondence was routine and legitimate. As international tensions increased during the late 1930s, the nature of these interactions subtly changed. Political developments in Asia began to influence conversations, though often indirectly. Trade restrictions, currency controls, and shipping delays became topics of practical concern. These were not classified matters. They were discussed openly in newspapers and business journals. Yet they reflected a world moving toward confrontation. Dickinson did not publicly align herself with any political cause. There is no record of her expressing overt support for Japanese military actions or opposition to American policy. Her outward life remained focused on business and social continuity. This absence of declared ideology would later complicate interpretations of her motive. It suggested that whatever decisions she made during the war did not originate in public conviction. The distinction between cultural familiarity and intelligence awareness is subtle but critical. Dickinson did not need access to secret documents to understand that the world was changing. She observed shifts in behavior. She noticed who stopped visiting, who became cautious, who spoke less freely. She tracked disruptions in shipping routes and delays in correspondence. These observations did not require espionage. They required attention. As diplomatic relations between the United States and Japan deteriorated, Japanese officials abroad faced increasing constraints. Their movements were monitored. Their communications were restricted. The formal channels through which information flowed narrowed. In such conditions, informal networks gained significance. Civilians who could communicate plausibly and legally across borders became valuable, whether they sought that role or not. Dickinson's business provided such plausibility. Correspondence about dolls raised no immediate suspicion. International shipments of collectibles were common. Letters discussing condition, restoration, and location were expected. The subject matter itself offered a vocabulary capable of substitution without distortion. This did not mean that such usage was inevitable, but it meant that the potential existed. The gradual shift from incidental observation to intentional communication did not announce itself. It unfolded within the same routines Dickinson had practiced for years. Letters were typed as they always had been. Addresses were written carefully. Tone remained professional and neutral. The difference lay in selection. What was included and what was omitted began to matter. By 1940 and 1941, American intelligence services were increasingly aware of foreign espionage efforts, but their resources were finite. Attention focused on overt threats, organized networks, and known agents. Civilians operating within legitimate professions were not immediate priorities, unless they displayed unusual behavior. Dickinson did not. Her shop operated during normal hours. Her correspondence volumes did not spike dramatically. Her financial activity appeared stable. When the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan, including restrictions on oil and metal exports, the atmosphere hardened. Diplomatic engagement became strained. Yet even then, official relations had not collapsed. Japanese diplomats remained in place. Cultural and commercial exchanges did not cease overnight. The lag between policy shift and enforcement created a narrow window in which existing networks could adapt. Pearl Harbor closed that window abruptly. The attack transformed relationships that had once been benign into sources of suspicion. Japanese nationals became enemy aliens. Japanese-American communities faced internment. Diplomatic missions were shuttered. Communication channels were severed or placed under strict control. The legal landscape shifted almost overnight. Yet the administrative reality was more complex. Surveillance systems required time to expand. Censorship protocols had to be implemented. Authorities prioritized immediate threats. During this transition, some channels continued to function, albeit under increasing scrutiny. Dickinson's correspondence fell within this space. It did not announce itself as urgent or political. It retained the language of commerce. The choice of South America as a destination for certain letters reflected an understanding of global intelligence geography. Argentina, in particular, remained officially neutral for much of the war. Axis intelligence networks operated there with relative freedom. Mail routed through such territories faced different levels of inspection. This was known to intelligence professionals. It did not require sophisticated training to recognize. Dickinson's letters did not contain encryption in the conventional sense. They relied on shared understanding. Descriptions of dolls stood in for descriptions of ships. References to repair mirrored maintenance schedules. Locations corresponded to ports and shipyards. This method depended on discipline. Any inconsistency could expose the system. The language had to remain plausible to outsiders, while conveying meaning to insiders. What distinguished Dickinson during this period was not recklessness, but restraint. She did not flood channels with information. She selected details that could be observed without access. Ship presence in harbors was visible. Repairs took time and left traces. Defensive installations altered landscapes. Such information could be gathered by anyone attentive to their surroundings. The act of transmission, rather than acquisition, carried the risk. Throughout this period, Dickinson's outward demeanor did not change. She did not withdraw from society. She did not display anxiety or urgency. She continued operating her shop as before. This continuity insulated her. It allowed her correspondence to blend into the vast volume of civilian mail that continued despite wartime disruption. The transformation underway was not one of identity, but of function. Dickinson did not become someone else. She remained a business owner, a correspondent, a participant in international exchange. What changed was the meaning of those actions. Within a world at war, activities that had once been neutral acquired strategic weight. Familiar language became a vehicle for unintended consequence. This phase of her story resists simple categorization. It does not conform to narratives of sudden betrayal or ideological conversion. Instead, it illustrates how espionage can emerge from ordinary structures when conditions shift. Dickinson did not invent a cover. She continued using one that already existed. By the end of this period, the boundaries that once separated civilian life from intelligence activity had narrowed to the point of overlap. Dickinson stood within that overlap, equipped by experience and positioned by circumstance. The war had transformed context without altering routine. The next phase would transform consequence, bringing scrutiny to practices that had previously escaped attention. The shop on Madison Avenue functioned with the precision of a controlled environment. Its existence depended on predictability, discretion, and the careful management of reputation. It opened each morning at a consistent hour and closed without fanfare in the evening. The displays were curated, rather than crowded, arranged to signal seriousness to those who understood the market. There were no handwritten signs, no promotional theatrics, no attempt to attract casual curiosity. Everything about the space communicated that it served a specific audience, and that it did so quietly. Inside, the operation followed established routines. Inventory records were maintained with care. Provenance documents were stored and cross-referenced. Correspondence related to acquisitions and sales was filed systematically. This was not a storefront built on impulse buying. Transactions often began weeks or months before money changed hands. Clients expected detailed descriptions, photographs, condition reports, and assurances of authenticity. Letters and typed memoranda were the backbone of these exchanges. Velvalee Dickinson occupied the center of this system without appearing dominant. She managed the flow of information, rather than controlling it overtly. Customers did not experience her as secretive. They experienced her as thorough. She answered inquiries with precision, provided context when necessary, and avoided speculation when facts could not be confirmed. This restraint reinforced trust. In the world of collectors, exaggeration was a liability. The shop's specialization in antique and foreign dolls naturally generated international correspondence. Collectors in Europe, Asia, and South America sought pieces unavailable locally. Shipping arrangements required advanced planning, documentation, and coordination with customs officials. These processes produced paper trails that appeared entirely legitimate. They also normalized the idea that detailed descriptions of objects and their locations would travel across borders. The language used in these descriptions was necessarily specific. Dolls were identified by origin, material, condition, and history. References to repairs, restorations, and alterations were common. Location mattered. Whether an item was in a private collection, a restoration facility, or a port city, affected its value and availability. None of this language was unusual within the trade. It was expected. The clientele reinforced this environment. Many were individuals accustomed to discretion. Diplomats, foreign nationals, and intermediaries did not announce their purchases publicly. They relied on trusted vendors to conduct transactions without publicity. The shop accommodated these expectations. Records were kept accurately, but not displayed. Conversations remained professional. The absence of spectacle was itself a signal of credibility. As the United States moved deeper into wartime posture, the shop did not alter its outward operations. It did not adopt patriotic displays or wartime messaging. It did not close or relocate. This continuity mattered. It allowed the business to remain part of the civilian background, rather than drawing attention through sudden change. From the outside, it appeared unaffected by global upheaval. Behind that appearance, the environment in which the shop operated had shifted. Wartime censorship expanded rapidly. Mail routes were monitored. International correspondence faced delays in inspection. Yet the sheer volume of civilian mail ensured that most letters still moved without incident. Businesses with legitimate reasons to communicate internationally were not immediately suspect unless they deviated from established patterns. The shop's correspondence did not deviate dramatically. The number of letters remained within expected ranges. The destinations aligned with known collectors and intermediaries. The subject matter remained consistent. This stability was not accidental. It reflected an understanding that any sudden increase or alteration in communication patterns could invite scrutiny. Within this structure, the shop became more than a place of commerce. It functioned as a node in a network of observation. Its proprietor had reasons to pay attention to shipping delays, port congestion, and customs bottlenecks. These factors affected delivery timelines and customer satisfaction. Monitoring them was part of good business practice. It also produced insight into broader patterns of movement. New York Harbor was visible from multiple vantage points. Ship arrivals and departures were reported publicly. Repairs conducted at naval yards altered traffic and schedules. Defensive installations changed landscapes along the waterfront. These developments were not hidden. They were part of the city's transformation under wartime conditions. Anyone attentive to routine could notice them. The shop's proximity to international clientele meant that information flowed in both directions. Customers shared observations about travel restrictions, port closures, and shipping risks. Such discussions were framed in commercial terms. They were not secret briefings. They were practical assessments of risk, yet they contributed to a broader understanding of wartime logistics. The act of translating these observations into correspondence required care. Letters had to remain plausible. They had to sound like business communication, not analysis. The discipline lay in selection. Only certain details could be included without raising questions. The shop's established language provided a framework within which this selection could occur. Typing played a central role. Typed letters conveyed professionalism and clarity. They also standardized appearance. The shop used consistent formatting, margins, and spacing. This consistency reinforced legitimacy. It also meant that correspondence bore identifiable mechanical characteristics, though this was not yet understood as a vulnerability. The shop's records were orderly. Financial transactions were documented. Payments were deposited through normal banking channels. Cash handling occurred, but did not dominate operations. From an accounting perspective, the business appeared healthy and conventional. There were no sudden influxes that demanded explanation. This environment insulated the shop from immediate suspicion, even as wartime counterintelligence efforts intensified. Investigators prioritized known networks, radio transmissions, and overtly political organizations. A doll shop operating within its niche did not register as a threat. Its legitimacy was its camouflage. The risk inherent in this arrangement was not visible to customers or casual observers. It lay in the assumption that ordinary structures could not be repurposed. The shop demonstrated how easily that assumption could fail. Without altering its outward form, it accommodated a different function layered onto existing routines. The transformation did not require new skills. It required restraint and consistency. Dickinson did not invent new behaviors. She applied familiar ones with different intent. The shop continued to serve collectors. It also became a conduit through which observations traveled outward under the guise of commerce. This phase of the story is defined by stillness rather than action. There were no dramatic moments within the shop's walls. There were no hurried departures or whispered exchanges. The danger lay in the absence of drama. It lay in the way routine insulated activity from scrutiny. By the time investigators would later examine the shop's correspondence, they would recognize how effectively it blended into civilian life. At the time, that effectiveness allowed it to function without interference. The shop stood as an example of how wartime intelligence vulnerabilities did not always arise from hidden operations, but from ordinary enterprises, operating exactly as they were designed to operate. As the war progressed, the shop remained open, its windows unchanged, its records intact. It was not the site of conspiracy in the conventional sense. It was the site of continuity, and within that continuity, information moved quietly, shaped by a world that no longer treated such movement as harmless. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not simply alter American foreign policy. It reordered the mechanics of daily life. Within hours, federal agencies shifted from monitoring to enforcement. Surveillance expanded, censorship hardened, and the assumption of benign intent dissolved. The distinction between civilian and combatant blurred in ways that few had anticipated. Activities once considered routine were reclassified as potential threats. Communication itself became suspect. In New York City, the effects were immediate but uneven. Naval installations tightened security. Ports restricted access. Newspapers carried official warnings and partial information, carefully filtered through government censors. The city adjusted in increments rather than absolutes. Businesses continued operating. Trains ran. Shops opened. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The tolerance for ambiguity narrowed. Mail censorship became one of the most expansive wartime undertakings. Letters crossing borders were intercepted, examined, delayed, or redirected. The volume was staggering. Millions of pieces of correspondence passed through inspection points, staffed by clerks trained to recognize irregularities. They were instructed not only to look for codes, but to identify patterns, destinations, and subject matter that might serve as conduits for intelligence. The task required discipline more than intuition. For businesses with legitimate international correspondence, this new environment introduced friction, but not prohibition. Exporters, importers, collectors, and intermediaries still needed to communicate. The government did not seek to halt commerce entirely. It sought to control information flow. This balance created space in which routine activity could continue, provided it adhered to established norms. Velvalee Dickinson's shop remained within those norms. Its correspondence did not suddenly adopt political language. It did not reference military matters directly. It did not expand in volume beyond expectation. From the perspective of postal systems, it appeared unchanged. That continuity was critical. Sudden alterations in behavior were more likely to attract attention than sustained routine. Yet the war imposed constraints that altered the meaning of what could be observed and transmitted. Information about naval movements, repairs, and defenses became classified, not because it was invisible, but because its interpretation carried strategic value. Ports that had once been tourist attractions were now operational zones. Shipyards that had once been industrial landmarks became guarded assets. Even the absence or presence of activity carried significance. Dickinson's proximity to these environments was incidental rather than engineered. New York Harbor was part of the city's fabric. Its changes were visible from public vantage points. Ships arrived damaged and departed restored. Defensive measures altered coastlines. Anti-submarine nets were installed. Blackout protocols reshaped nighttime routines. These developments were not hidden from view, but their aggregation required attention over time. The war also reshaped the social environment in which Dickinson operated. Japanese nationals were now enemy aliens. Japanese American communities were subjected to surveillance, and in many cases, forced relocation. Diplomatic missions were closed or repurposed. The individuals Dickinson had known through cultural and commercial associations either disappeared from public life or operated under severe restrictions. Communication routes narrowed. Official channels closed. Informal pathways gained importance. Intelligence services understood this dynamic. They monitored not only known agents, but also civilians, whose legitimate activities intersected with restricted information flows. Yet resources were finite. Priorities centered on overt threats and known networks. Within this compressed environment, correspondence became both risk and opportunity. Letters could no longer be assumed private. They were subject to inspection, delay, and interception. Yet the sheer scale of mail ensured that not everything could be scrutinized in depth. Analysts relied on triage. They flagged anomalies and followed patterns. Dickinson's letters began to take on a different weight. They did not announce themselves as wartime documents. They retained the language of commerce. Dolls remained the subject. Descriptions remained detailed. The difference lay in alignment. References to condition, repair, and location began to coincide with observable naval realities. The timing of letters aligned with known movements and maintenance schedules. This alignment was not immediately apparent to censors reading individual letters in isolation. It emerged only when multiple letters were compared. When patterns were traced across time and destination, such analysis required patience and aggregation. It was not the work of frontline inspectors, but of specialists trained to contextualize information. The war also introduced new legal frameworks. Censorship statutes expanded government authority over communication. Violations carried severe penalties. Espionage laws were invoked more readily. The threshold for prosecution lowered in the name of national security. This legal environment increased the stakes for anyone transmitting information that could be construed as harmful. Dickinson's activities did not escalate dramatically in response to these changes. She did not accelerate correspondence. She did not alter tone. She did not seek new channels. Instead, she maintained existing practices with disciplined restraint. This restraint minimized exposure. It also demonstrated an understanding of risk. The decision to route correspondence through South America reflected strategic awareness rather than desperation. Neutral or semi-neutral territories provided intermediaries for access intelligence networks. Mail passing through such regions faced different levels of scrutiny. This routing was not illegal in itself. It was common practice for international businesses, navigating wartime disruptions, yet it also aligned with known intelligence pathways. At the same time, the United States government intensified efforts to monitor foreign financial flows. Banks were instructed to report suspicious transactions. Safe deposit boxes came under scrutiny. Cash movements were tracked with increasing sophistication. Dickinson's financial activity, though not immediately alarming, began to attract interest as patterns were cross-referenced with correspondence. The war forced investigators to rethink assumptions about who constituted a threat. Espionage was no longer imagined solely as the domain of trained operatives, using clandestine methods. It could be conducted by civilians leveraging ordinary professions. This realization did not arise overnight. It emerged through cases like Dickinson's, where legitimacy masked vulnerability. During this period, the shop continued to function without interruption. Customers came and went. Inventory shifted. Correspondence was sent and received. There were no visible signs of strain. To outsiders, the business appeared resilient, even insulated from wartime disruption. This appearance contributed to its longevity. The tension of this phase lay not in overt action, but in accumulation. Each letter carried potential consequence. Each observation transmitted carried risk. The margin for error narrowed as the war intensified. Dickinson's success in avoiding detection during this period depended on consistency and restraint rather than boldness. Investigators, for their part, faced challenges inherent in wartime intelligence. They could not act on suspicion alone. They required evidence sufficient to support prosecution under expanded, but still constrained legal standards. They needed to demonstrate intent, not merely coincidence. This requirement slowed response, but preserved legitimacy. As months passed, the alignment between dull correspondence and naval activity became harder to dismiss. Analysts reconstructed information flows, mapping descriptions to ship movements and repairs. The picture that emerged suggested intentional transmission rather than accidental overlap. Yet the case was not yet complete. Names on letters did not match known suspects. Identities were obscured through borrowed signatures. The war demanded patience from both sides. Dickinson continued operating within narrowed boundaries, adapting without disruption. Investigators continued assembling fragments, resisting premature action. The confrontation between these trajectories had not yet occurred, but it was becoming inevitable. This phase of the story illustrates how war transforms context before it produces confrontation. The systems that once facilitated harmless exchange became instruments of scrutiny. Activities that once carried no weight acquired strategic significance. Dickinson's routines, unchanged in form, now existed within a framework that no longer tolerated innocence by default. By the end of this period, the environment was fully militarized. Communication was regulated. Observation carried consequence. The shop remained open, but it existed under an invisible layer of surveillance. The war had not yet exposed its role, but it had rendered exposure unavoidable. The letters that moved outward from New York did not rely on secrecy in the conventional sense. They did not conceal words through substitution tables or mathematical systems. They depended instead on familiarity. Their effectiveness rested on the assumption that meaning could be carried by context rather than cipher. To an untrained reader, the correspondence appeared technical but benign, focused on objects whose value lay in craftsmanship and history. To a reader prepared to interpret them, the letters conveyed operational detail. The structure of the language followed the conventions of the doll trade. Objects were identified by origin, age, material, and condition. Quantities were noted. References to damage and restoration were routine. Locations were specified because location affected valuation and availability. The vocabulary was precise because imprecision reduced credibility with collectors. This precision provided the foundation for an open code that could function without altering tone or format. Within this framework, entire phrases stood in for categories of information. Types of dolls corresponded to classes of vessels. National origin carried significance beyond aesthetics. Condition reports aligned with damage assessments. References to repair or restoration mirrored maintenance status. Locations mapped to ports and shipyards. The code did not disguise itself as something else. it hid within what it already was. The discipline required to maintain such a system was considerable. Any deviation risked exposure. The language had to remain consistent with trade practice. It could not introduce anomalies that would attract attention from postal inspectors or censors trained to identify irregularities. The correspondence, therefore, adhered strictly to established patterns. It neither dramatized nor simplified. It reported. Timing mattered as much as language. Letters were sent when information was current, but not urgent. They avoided the appearance of immediacy. Delays were acceptable within commercial correspondence, particularly during wartime disruptions. This tolerance allowed information to move without signaling priority. The absence of urgency reduced suspicion. The destinations were chosen with similar care. South American addresses provided plausible endpoints for collector networks. They also aligned with known intelligence relay routes, operating under neutrality. Mail to such regions was common enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, yet strategically positioned to be forwarded onward. The routing did not violate regulations. It exploited them. From the perspective of wartime censors, individual letters did not stand out. Each was evaluated within the context of millions. Only when multiple letters were examined together did patterns emerge. This aggregation was not immediate. It required analysts to step back from individual content and examine relationships across time and destination. The system depended on restraint. The correspondence did not attempt to convey comprehensive intelligence. It selected details that could be observed without access to restricted facilities. Ships entering and leaving harbor were visible. Repair activity altered schedules and silhouettes. Defensive measures changed waterfront profiles. Such observations could be made by civilians attentive to their surroundings. The act of transmission, not collection, carried risk. The use of typed correspondence reinforced legitimacy. Typing conveyed professionalism. It suggested business rather than personal communication. The formatting remained consistent. Margins, spacing, and layout followed commercial norms. This consistency supported the illusion of routine. It also introduced a vulnerability, not yet understood by the sender. Mechanical uniformity. Each typewriter produced distinctive impressions. Keys wore unevenly. Alignment shifted subtly. These characteristics could be traced across documents. At the time the letters were written, this forensic capability was not widely appreciated outside specialized circles. The assumption that typing anonymized authorship proved mistaken. The choice to use borrowed identities added a layer of separation. Signatures belonged to real individuals within the collector community. Their names lent authenticity. Yet this practice introduced risk. When letters were returned undelivered, the forged identities came into contact with reality. A real collector confronted with correspondence they had not written became an inadvertent witness. The system's strength lay in its ordinariness. The letters did not require encryption equipment or clandestine meetings. They relied on mail systems designed to move vast quantities of paper efficiently. They relied on professions that already trafficked in description and documentation. They relied on a world that assumed innocence, unless confronted with evidence. As the war progressed, analysts tasked with reviewing intercepted correspondence began to notice repetition. Certain phrases recurred. Certain combinations of description aligned too closely with known naval events. When letters discussing restoration coincided with documented ship repairs, coincidence became less plausible. The realization did not occur instantly. It emerged through accumulation. The code's open nature meant that once identified, it was vulnerable. Analysts could reconstruct meaning by mapping language to events. They could test hypotheses against known timelines. Each successful match strengthened confidence that the correspondence was intentional. What had once seemed harmless became legible. The recognition of an open code altered investigative priorities. Rather than searching for hidden symbols or encrypted text, analysts focused on language itself. The implications extended beyond a single case. The discovery challenged assumptions about intelligence transmission. It demonstrated that effective espionage did not require secrecy in form, only in interpretation. It underscored the vulnerability of systems built on trust and volume. For the sender, the code's success depended on the belief that such interpretation would not occur. It relied on the assumption that censors would evaluate letters individually rather than collectively. For a time, that assumption held. The system functioned because it blended into routine. As investigators began assembling the pieces, the margin for error narrowed. Each additional letter increased exposure. The system that had operated quietly now existed under analytical scrutiny. The language remained unchanged, but its meaning was no longer private. This phase marked a turning point. The correspondence had crossed from unnoticed routine into examined pattern. The open code, once invisible, had been recognized. From that moment, the outcome would depend not on language alone, but on the ability of investigators to trace authorship and intent. The language of dolls had carried information farther than its creator anticipated. It had done so precisely because it appeared harmless. Now that harmlessness had been stripped away, leaving behind a structure that could be followed back to its source. The system began to fail, not through exposure, but through friction. Wartime mail moved under pressure, and pressure revealed seams. Letters were delayed, rerouted, and sometimes returned. Postal markings accumulated. Addresses that had once functioned without issue suddenly produced rejections. Neutrality shifted. Bureaucracies tightened. What had been a reliable pathway became unpredictable. Several letters sent under borrowed names were returned to their points of origin marked with routine notices, indicating delivery failure. These returns were not dramatic. They did not announce wrongdoing. They represented ordinary administrative outcomes in an extraordinary environment. Yet they altered the balance of risk. A letter that did not arrive could be seen by someone unintended. A name used for cover could be confronted with evidence of misuse. One such return reached a doll collector, whose identity had been appropriated without consent. The individual recognized the discrepancy immediately. The content reflected familiarity with the trade, but the circumstances did not align with their own actions. They had not sent the letter. They had no business contact with the addressee. The return transformed abstraction into fact. It confirmed impersonation. The collector did not respond publicly. They contacted authorities through appropriate channels, presenting the returned correspondence and explaining its inconsistency with their activities. This action introduced a civilian witness into what had previously been an internal analytical process. It provided confirmation that the letters were not merely coincidental in language, but deliberately misattributed. For investigators, this was a pivot. Until then, analysis had relied on pattern recognition and hypothesis. Now there was corroboration. A real identity had been misused. The misuse could be demonstrated. This shifted the inquiry from interpretive to evidentiary. It narrowed the field. Attention turned decisively toward authorship. Analysts revisited the letters with a different objective. They compared formatting, spacing, and mechanical characteristics. The typewritten text revealed consistencies that transcended content. Certain letters exhibited the same irregularities in alignment. Specific characters showed wear patterns that repeated across documents mailed from different cities and signed by different names. The implication was clear. The letters did not originate from the individuals whose names appeared at the bottom. They were produced by the same machine, or by machines sharing distinctive characteristics. This realization transformed hotel registries and travel records into investigative tools. If a single typist had used publicly accessible machines while traveling, those machines could be traced through time and location. Investigators cross-referenced mailing dates with known travel itineraries. They examined hotel records in cities from which letters had been posted. They identified properties offering business centers or public typewriters. Overlaps emerged. A married couple appeared repeatedly in registries during periods that aligned with letter production. The pattern did not prove guilt, but it concentrated suspicion. At this stage, the investigation remained compartmentalized. Knowledge was shared selectively. The objective was to avoid alerting potential suspects or accomplices. Surveillance expanded quietly. Financial records were reviewed. Banking activity was analyzed for irregularities. Safe deposit box access was logged. The goal was not immediate arrest, but confirmation. The returned letters also prompted deeper linguistic analysis. With confirmation of forgery, analysts re-evaluated content with increased confidence. They mapped descriptions to known naval events with greater precision. The correlations held. References to restoration aligned with documented repair schedules. Mentions of location coincided with port activity. The pattern was no longer speculative. The legal framework required evidence sufficient to demonstrate intent under wartime statutes. Open codes, by their nature, invited defense arguments centered on coincidence and interpretation. Prosecutors would need to show not only that information was transmitted, but that it was knowingly and deliberately conveyed for hostile purposes. The misuse of identities helped establish intent, but more was needed. Surveillance intensified around the suspected source. Movements were tracked. Correspondence volumes were noted. Banking activity was monitored for connections to foreign sources. The investigation advanced without confrontation. The objective was to document, not disrupt. The letters that came back thus served as catalysts, rather than conclusions. They transformed an abstract analytical exercise into a concrete case. They exposed vulnerabilities in the system of concealment. They demonstrated that even carefully constructed routines could be undone by administrative chance. For the sender, the returns represented an unseen warning. The system had depended on uninterrupted flow. Disruption introduced exposure. Yet there was no immediate signal that the warning had been received. Correspondence continued. The routines held. The investigation now moved with momentum. Analysts no longer asked whether the letters constituted espionage. They asked how far the operation extended and who stood behind it. The answers would require patience, documentation, and timing. This phase marked the transition from detection to pursuit. The war had tightened its grip on communication. And within that tightening, a flaw had revealed itself. The letters that failed to arrive had succeeded in something else entirely. They had ensured that the operation could no longer remain invisible. Once authorship became the central question, the investigation shifted from interpretation to attribution. The letters themselves no longer stood alone as artifacts of suspicious correspondence. They became evidence of process. Each page carried not only words, but mechanical history. Investigators understood that typing was not anonymous. Machines left traces. Those traces could be followed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's laboratory analysts began a systematic comparison of the intercepted letters. They examined spacing between characters, alignment inconsistencies, and wear patterns on individual keys. Certain letters struck heavier than others. Some characters sat slightly higher or lower on the line. These features repeated across documents mailed under different names and from different cities. The consistency suggested a single source. This realization reframed the inquiry. Instead of chasing multiple senders scattered across the country, investigators focused on one typist who had moved between locations. Travel records became relevant. Hotel registries were reviewed. Particular attention was given to hotels known to provide business services to guests. Publicly accessible typewriters, maintained for correspondence, were common in such establishments. Investigators overlaid mailing dates with known travel itineraries. They identified periods when letters were posted from cities where a particular couple had stayed. The alignment was not perfect, but it was persistent. In multiple instances, letters mailed from a city coincided with the presence of the same individuals in hotels offering typewriter access. The probability of coincidence diminished with each match. The inquiry did not yet name a suspect publicly, but internally, focus narrowed. Surveillance teams were assigned discreetly. Movements were tracked without interference. The objective was to confirm patterns without alerting the subject. Wartime counterintelligence emphasized patience. Premature action risked losing evidence or provoking defensive behavior. Financial analysis complemented mechanical tracing. Banking records revealed deposits that exceeded the apparent scale of the business, while not immediately incriminating. The timing of certain transactions aligned with known diplomatic activity. Cash deposits, in particular, attracted scrutiny. Investigators sought to determine whether funds could be linked to foreign sources operating under diplomatic cover. Safe deposit box access logs provided another layer. The frequency and timing of visits were noted. Investigators did not yet know what was stored, but they understood that such boxes often held cash, documents, or instruments not intended for daily handling. Surveillance was authorized to observe future access. At the same time, analysts continued reconstructing the content of the letters. They correlated descriptions with naval intelligence records. The matches held under scrutiny. References to repair coincided with documented maintenance periods. Mentions of location aligned with ship movements. The pattern was coherent enough to demonstrate intent rather than accident. The investigation expanded cautiously. Associates were identified and evaluated. Known contacts with foreign nationals were reviewed. Participation in cultural organizations was re-examined under wartime standards. None of these activities were illegal in isolation, but collectively they provided context. Throughout this phase, the subject's outward behavior remained unchanged. The shop continued operating. Correspondence continued at a measured pace. There was no indication of panic or adjustment. This consistency reinforced investigators' belief that the subject was unaware of the inquiry. It also provided an opportunity to observe without interference. The typewriter evidence proved decisive in shaping investigative strategy. It demonstrated that the letters were not decentralized. They originated from a single operational source. This allowed investigators to concentrate resources. It also simplified the narrative that would later be presented in court. Mechanical consistency offered tangible proof beyond interpretation. Legal advisors were consulted to ensure that evidence collection adhered to statutory requirements. Wartime laws expanded authority, but did not eliminate procedural safeguards. Any arrest would need to withstand scrutiny. Evidence had to be obtained lawfully and documented thoroughly. The case would likely attract public attention once revealed. As evidence accumulated, investigators faced the question of timing. Allowing the operation to continue risked further intelligence leakage. Intervening too early risked an incomplete case. The balance shifted gradually toward action as corroboration mounted. The typewriter, an ordinary tool of commerce, had become the operation's most significant vulnerability. Its uniformity betrayed authorship. Its accessibility linked travel to transmission. What had once conveyed professionalism now conveyed identity. This phase of the story is defined by convergence. Separate lines of inquiry, linguistic, mechanical, financial, and behavioral, began to intersect. Each reinforced the others. The case no longer depended on a single insight. It rested on accumulation. By the end of this period, investigators were confident they knew who stood behind the letters. What remained was to determine how and when to act. The operation had been traced. The evidence had been assembled. The final step would require precision, equal to that which had sustained the operation for so long. With authorship established, investigators turned to the question that would define the case beyond mechanics and language. Why the operation existed, and how it was sustained. Espionage required motive, and motive often left financial traces. The transition from pattern recognition to intent demanded proof that information had not merely been transmitted, but that it had been exchanged for value. Financial records became central. Banking activity, associated with Velvalee Dickinson's business, was reviewed over an extended period, rather than in isolation. Deposits were analyzed for frequency, amount, and form. Most transactions aligned with expectations for a specialized retail operation. Payments from collectors and intermediaries appeared routine. Expenses matched inventory acquisition and operating costs. The shop on paper functioned as a legitimate enterprise. What drew attention were deposits that did not fit the established rhythm. Cash appeared in amounts that exceeded what could reasonably be attributed to walk-in sales. The timing of these deposits corresponded not to peak retail periods, but to moments associated with diplomatic movement and international contact. Investigators did not immediately interpret this as proof of wrongdoing. Cash handling was not illegal. Yet in wartime, unexplained liquidity warranted explanation. Analysts traced the sources of funds where possible. Some deposits were indirect, routed through intermediaries, or associated with accounts linked to foreign nationals. Diplomatic immunity complicated matters. Transactions involving individuals attached to foreign missions did not always leave complete trails. This ambiguity did not negate significance. It reinforced it. Safe deposit box access became a focal point. Banks maintained meticulous records of entry and exit. Dickinson's visits were infrequent, but deliberate. Each visit occurred during standard hours, without haste or deviation. The pattern suggested storage, rather than transaction. Investigators understood that safe deposit boxes were often used to hold cash or documents not intended for daily circulation. Authorization was obtained to observe future access. Surveillance teams were positioned discreetly. The objective was not confrontation but confirmation. When Dickinson entered the bank, her behavior did not suggest urgency. She followed routine procedures. She did not linger. The act of access itself mattered more than its duration. Parallel to financial analysis, investigators examined the broader context of motive. There was no evidence of ideological extremism or public allegiance to a foreign power. The case did not fit narratives of political conversion or fanaticism. Instead, it suggested pragmatism. The operation appeared transactional rather than ideological. This interpretation aligned with known intelligence practices of the period. Foreign intelligence services often recruited civilians not through persuasion, but through opportunity. Individuals with access to observation and communication channels were compensated for information that could be obtained without trespass. Such arrangements minimized risk and maximized plausibility. The scale of compensation mattered. It did not suggest enrichment beyond measure. It suggested supplementation. The amounts were sufficient to incentivize cooperation, without attracting attention. This balance indicated professional guidance rather than improvisation. Investigators also considered the role of personal relationships. Dickinson's pre-war associations with Japanese officials provided context. Trust established over years could facilitate discreet exchange. The absence of overt recruitment markers did not preclude collaboration. In intelligence work, continuity often replaced ceremony. As financial patterns were cross-referenced with correspondence timelines, the alignment strengthened the case. Letters describing particular conditions were followed by deposits. The sequence repeated enough times to establish correlation beyond chance. This sequence was critical. It demonstrated exchange, rather than coincidence. Legal advisors reviewed the evidence with caution. Espionage charges required proof that information was transmitted with intent to aid an enemy. Financial compensation supported this intent. Yet prosecutors also recognized the challenges of presenting open code interpretation to a jury. The strategy would need to emphasize pattern, corroboration and motive, rather than relying on any single element. Investigators also evaluated whether additional participants were involved. Financial flows did not suggest a network of domestic collaborators. There was no evidence of redistribution or shared compensation. The operation appeared centralized. This simplicity reduced complexity, but heightened individual responsibility. Throughout this phase, Dickinson's outward life remained unchanged. She continued operating her shop. She did not alter her routines. There were no signs of panic or withdrawal. This consistency suggested that she remained unaware of the investigation's depth. It also allowed surveillance to continue without disruption. The accumulation of financial evidence marked a turning point. The case no longer rested solely on interpretation of language or mechanical tracing. It now included motive, supported by material benefit. This combination strengthened the legal position and narrowed options. The decision to proceed toward arrest was not taken lightly. Investigators weighed the risk of allowing further transmissions against the benefit of capturing additional evidence. The balance tipped as the case reached sufficiency. The operation had been documented. The motive had been established. Further delay offered diminishing returns. Preparation for arrest focused on timing and context. The objective was to secure evidence without escalation. A controlled environment was preferred. The safe deposit box emerged as the optimal point of intervention. It promised access to stored assets and documentation. It also minimized public disruption. This phase closed with alignment. Language mechanics, finance and motive converged into a coherent narrative. The operation that had relied on ordinary structures now faced an extraordinary response. The war had narrowed tolerance for ambiguity to zero. What remained was execution of the final step. The question was no longer whether action would be taken. It was how cleanly and decisively it could be done. By January 1944, the investigation had reached its threshold. The accumulation of evidence no longer benefited from patience. Each additional day carried the risk of further transmission, however limited. The decision to act was framed not as a dramatic intervention, but as a controlled conclusion to a process already complete. Preparation was meticulous. Surveillance teams coordinated with banking officials under strict confidentiality. Legal authority was secured to ensure that the arrest would withstand scrutiny under wartime statutes. The objective was containment and preservation of evidence. There would be no pursuit, no confrontation in public view, no unnecessary escalation. The moment chosen was routine by design. The bank was a familiar environment for Dickinson. Her visits followed predictable patterns. She arrived during standard hours, conducted her business efficiently, and departed without lingering. On January 21, 1944, surveillance confirmed her entry. Agents positioned themselves to observe without interference. When she accessed her safe deposit box, the conditions for intervention were met. The arrest occurred without resistance. It unfolded as a procedural act, rather than a spectacle. Agents identified themselves, placed her into custody, and secured the contents of the safe deposit box. The transition from observation to enforcement was immediate and final. The operation had been designed to minimize uncertainty, and it succeeded. Inside the box, agents found what they expected. Cash was present in amounts that exceeded normal business needs. The money was organized, not concealed hastily. There were no signs of panic or improvisation. The contents suggested planning rather than impulse. The sums recovered reinforced conclusions, already drawn through financial analysis. The arrest did not trigger immediate public disclosure. Wartime censorship extended to criminal proceedings involving national security. Authorities controlled information released to prevent panic or exploitation by enemy intelligence. Internally, the case was treated with gravity, rather than triumph. It represented both a success and a warning. Dickinson was transported for processing without incident. She did not attempt to flee. She did not resist. Her demeanor remained composed. This comportment did not alter the substance of the case, but it influenced its management. Investigators proceeded methodically, documenting each step. The immediate focus shifted to securing records. The shop on Madison Avenue was examined. Correspondence files were reviewed. Inventory logs were cross-referenced with mailing dates. Typewriter access was assessed. The objective was not to dismantle a network. There was no evidence of one, but to preserve the integrity of evidence already collected. The arrest reverberated quietly through intelligence circles. It confirmed suspicions that espionage could be embedded within ordinary professions. It validated analytical approaches that prioritized pattern over spectacle. It also underscored the importance of civilian vigilance. Without the returned letter in the collector's report, the case might have taken longer to mature. Public awareness followed later, filtered through official statements and controlled narratives. When news emerged, it emphasized novelty rather than nuance. Headlines focused on the contrast between dolls and destruction, commerce and conflict. The label attached to Dickinson simplified the story for mass consumption. Internally, the case was understood as more complex. Legal proceedings were shaped by wartime considerations. Prosecutors weighed charges carefully. Espionage statutes carried severe penalties, including the possibility of capital punishment. Yet the evidentiary challenges of open code interpretation influenced strategy. Authorities sought a resolution that balanced accountability with certainty. Negotiations began under this framework. The government prioritized preventing further intelligence leakage and understanding the scope of foreign operations. Dickinson's cooperation became a factor. The most severe charges were reconsidered in exchange for admissions that could be secured and defended. Throughout this period, Dickinson remained in custody. Her business ceased operations. The shop that had functioned quietly for years closed without ceremony. Its absence drew little immediate notice in a city consumed by war. The closure was a footnote, rather than an event. The arrest marked the visible end of the operation, but not its significance. Investigators continued analyzing correspondence to ensure no additional channels existed. Financial records were reviewed to confirm no undiscovered accounts. Associates were questioned and cleared where appropriate. The objective was closure without residue. This phase of the story is defined by restraint. The arrest was not designed to dramatize guilt. It was designed to neutralize risk. The absence of spectacle reflected confidence in the evidence. The case did not require theater to justify itself. By the time Dickinson entered the formal legal process, the narrative had already been established internally. The letters had been traced, the code had been decoded, the motive had been documented. The arrest did not initiate these conclusions. It confirmed them. The operation that had relied on ordinary systems was halted by ordinary procedures, applied with extraordinary attention. The war continued beyond this moment, shaped by battles far removed from Madison Avenue. Yet within the machinery of national security, the arrest represented a decisive correction. The final phase would not be determined by investigation, but by judgment. Once the arrest was complete, the case moved from intelligence containment to legal reckoning. The transition altered priorities, but not stakes. What had been assembled through months of analysis now had to withstand the demands of prosecution in a wartime courtroom. Evidence that convinced investigators had to convince a judge. Interpretations had to be anchored to statute. Intent had to be demonstrated without reliance on assumption or inference alone. The legal framework governing the case reflected the urgency of national survival. Wartime censorship statutes granted the government broad authority to regulate and punish the transmission of information deemed harmful to military operations. These laws did not require proof of espionage in the classical sense. They required proof that restricted information had been knowingly communicated in violation of regulations designed to protect national security. This distinction shaped prosecutorial strategy. Espionage charges remained an option, but they carried risks. Open code cases were inherently complex. Defense counsel could argue ambiguity, coincidence, or alternative interpretation. Even with financial evidence and mechanical tracing, a jury unfamiliar with intelligence methods might struggle to grasp the significance of pattern-based proof. Prosecutors had to weigh the symbolic value of an espionage conviction against the practical certainty of a censorship violation plea. The decision to pursue a negotiated resolution was not an act of leniency. It was a calculated choice. The government sought a conviction that would stand unchallenged and send a clear message without risking acquittal on technical grounds. In exchange for cooperation and admission of censorship violations, the most severe charges were set aside. The possibility of capital punishment receded, replaced by a sentence that reflected both punishment and deterrence. Court proceedings unfolded under the constraints of wartime secrecy. Portions of the evidence remained classified. The public record was incomplete by design. What emerged was a narrative stripped of operational detail but sufficient to establish culpability. The court emphasized the seriousness of transmitting information that could endanger naval forces, regardless of the method used. The sentencing phase underscored the gravity of the offense. The judge framed the case not as an eccentric anomaly, but as a deliberate violation of trust during a period of national peril. The sentence imposed reflected the maximum allowable under the applicable statutes: 10 years of imprisonment and a substantial monetary fine. The decision communicated that ordinary appearance offered no mitigation when national security was at stake. Imprisonment removed the subject from public life. The routines that had sustained the operation ceased. The shop remained closed. Correspondence ended. The structures that had enabled transmission were dismantled without ceremony. Incarceration imposed a different rhythm, one defined by regulation rather than discretion. Within intelligence circles, the case prompted reassessment. Analysts reviewed censorship protocols and pattern detection methods. Training emphasized the identification of open codes and the aggregation of seemingly innocuous correspondence. The lesson was institutional rather than personal. It reinforced the understanding that espionage could inhabit ordinary systems without altering their form. The war continued beyond the courtroom, driven by forces far larger than any single case. Naval battles were fought. Shipyards worked without pause. Intelligence services adapted continuously. Yet the case's impact endured in quieter ways. It reshaped assumptions about who could transmit information and how. It validated methods that prioritized patience and context over spectacle. Years passed before release, under supervision, brought the subject back into civilian life. By then, the world had changed again. The war had ended. Alliances had shifted. Public memory moved on. The case receded into archives, resurfacing only as a historical example of unconventional espionage. Judgment in wartime did not seek to resolve motive in moral terms. It sought to establish accountability under law. The sentence closed the legal chapter, but it did not simplify the story. It left unanswered questions about intention, justification, and perception. Those questions remained for historians, rather than courts. The operation that had depended on ordinary structures was terminated by ordinary legal processes, applied with extraordinary seriousness. The case demonstrated that in wartime, the margin for innocence was narrow and the cost of misjudgment severe. The story does not end with absolution or condemnation beyond the sentence imposed. It ends with a system asserting its boundaries. In doing so, it revealed both its vulnerability and its capacity to adapt when vigilance overcame assumption. The conclusion of the case did not produce closure in the conventional sense. It produced silence. Once sentencing was complete and incarceration began, the public narrative surrounding Velvalee Dickinson narrowed rapidly. Wartime attention shifted forward, not backward. The United States was engaged in a global struggle that demanded constant focus. Individual cases, Even those that had briefly captured imagination were absorbed into the administrative machinery of history. Inside the federal prison system, Dickinson ceased to exist as a public figure. She became an inmate, defined by number, schedule, and regulation. The routines that had once sustained her autonomy were replaced by institutional order. Her days followed fixed structures imposed without negotiation. The environment offered no platform, no audience, no leverage. It demanded compliance rather than discretion. The intelligence value of her cooperation was finite. Whatever information she possessed about methods, contacts, or channels was absorbed, evaluated, and filed. Intelligence work rarely provides dramatic revelations at its conclusion. It provides confirmation, refinement, and elimination of uncertainty. Once those objectives were met, attention moved on. The war itself reshaped priorities again. As Allied forces advanced, intelligence focus shifted toward new theaters and emerging threats. The mechanisms that had detected Dickinson's correspondence were adapted to confront more sophisticated challenges. Radio interception, cryptography, and counterintelligence expanded in scope and complexity. The Dahl letters became a reference point, rather than an active concern. When the war ended in 1945, the legal and cultural environment changed yet again. Wartime censorship laws expired, or were revised. Surveillance programs contracted. Public appetite for stories of internal threat diminished. The nation turned toward reconstruction and redefinition. The case faded from memory, outside professional circles. Dickinson's release in April 1951 occurred without public notice. She did not emerge into a world eager to receive her. Conditional release placed her under supervision, restricting movement and activity. She was no longer a business owner. She was no longer a correspondent. The structures that had defined her adult life were gone. Her subsequent efforts to rebuild were modest and controlled. Employment was secured through family connections rather than ambition. Work at a hospital reflected both necessity and invisibility. It offered routine without prominence. It did not invite scrutiny. It allowed survival without reinvention. At some point after release, she changed her name. The act was administrative rather than symbolic. It did not announce transformation. It facilitated disappearance. Under a new identity, she moved through the remainder of her life without public record or attention. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no attempts at explanation. Silence became permanent. Her death, recorded quietly around 1980, did not prompt retrospection at the time. No obituaries revisited the case. No public reckoning followed. The story remained confined to archives, court records, and intelligence histories. It existed as documentation rather than memory. For historians and intelligence professionals, the significance of the case lay not in its novelty, but in its implications. It demonstrated that espionage could operate without clandestine infrastructure. It showed that ordinary professions could become conduits for intelligence when circumstances aligned. It highlighted the importance of pattern recognition over isolated interpretation. The case also underscored the role of chance in detection. Had the letters not been returned, had a forged identity not intersected with a vigilant civilian, the operation might have continued longer. Intelligence work often hinges on such intersections. Systems are designed to detect anomalies, but anomalies must still occur. The doll shop itself left no physical trace. Madison Avenue evolved. Businesses changed. The storefront was absorbed into the city's constant renewal. There is no marker indicating what once operated there. The absence is complete. Only records preserve its existence. In broader historical context, the case occupies a narrow but instructive space. It does not redefine the war. It does not alter outcomes. It illustrates vulnerability. It shows how assumptions about harmlessness can be exploited. It reinforces the principle that security failures often arise not from malice alone, but from trust unexamined. The story's endurance owes much to its incongruity. Dolls and war occupy opposing symbolic spaces. That contrast attracts attention, yet focusing on novelty risks obscuring substance. The substance of the case lies in its ordinariness. Nothing about the operation required extraordinary resources. It relied on routine, patience, and plausibility. The absence of dialogue in the historical record reinforces this ordinariness. There are no dramatic exchanges preserved, no confessions recorded in memorable language. The case unfolds through documents, patterns, and procedures. Its power lies in accumulation rather than declaration. In the end, the case does not offer moral clarity. It does not provide a definitive explanation of motive that satisfies narrative expectations. It presents actions and consequences within a specific historical context. Judgment was rendered according to law. History retains ambiguity. The war produced countless stories of heroism and sacrifice. It also produced quieter narratives of vulnerability and correction. The doll woman case belongs to the latter. It is a reminder that national security is not safeguarded solely by armies and fleets, but by attention to detail, institutional patience, and the willingness to question what appears ordinary. As archives continue to open, and histories are revisited, the case persists as a study rather than a legend. It informs training. It shapes analysis. It warns against complacency. It does not seek sympathy or condemnation. It seeks understanding. The story concludes not with resolution, but with absorption into record. What remains is not the figure of Velvalee Dickinson, but the lesson embedded in her actions. In wartime, innocence is not assumed. It is evaluated, and sometimes it is found to be a function of appearance rather than reality. That lesson endures long after the letter stopped moving and the shop disappeared from view. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.